My boyfriend said he wanted an open relationship, so I opened it up to his family tree. The night Ronan proposed an open relationship, he did it over a $340 dinner that I paid for, at a restaurant where the hostess already knew my credit card by its last 4 digits because I'd been covering every anniversary, every birthday, every let me treat you, that was really just me treating myself to the illusion that this man was worth the investment. He slid a velvet box across the white tablecloth, and for one wild, stupid second, I thought he was proposing for real, down on one knee, the whole fairy tale. Instead, inside the box was a key to our apartment with a little tag that read freedom in his handwriting. And he leaned back in his chair with that grin he used when he thought he was being profound and said, "I want us to explore. There are so many experiences out there, and life's too short to limit ourselves." He was wearing the Omega watch I'd bought him for his 30th birthday. His shirt was from the Nordstrom haul I'd put on my Amex 3 weeks earlier. Even the cologne I could smell across the table was a Tom Ford bottle I'd ordered because he'd circled it in a magazine and left it on the bathroom counter like a Christmas list. I looked at him and saw clearly for the first time in 4 years that I had built this man's entire aesthetic from scratch with my own money and my own taste, and he was now using the confidence I'd manufactured to tell me he wanted to sleep with other women. I'd been with Ronan Calloway since I was 24, fresh out of a master's program in healthcare administration, and starting my first real job at a hospital network's corporate office. He was working part-time at a rock climbing gym and talking about launching a fitness brand that never materialized, which was fine at first because ambition can look a lot like potential when you're young enough to confuse the two. We met through my college friend Delia, who warned me he was charming, but between things, which is the polite way of saying unemployed with a nice jawline. Ronan had the kind of charisma that made you forget to ask follow-up questions. He'd talk about his 5-year plan with such conviction that you'd find yourself nodding along, not realizing he'd had the same 5-year plan for the last 8 years. By year 2 of our relationship, I was covering 70% of the rent on our apartment, paying for all groceries, and bankrolling what he called his brand development, which consisted mostly of Instagram posts taken in clothes I'd purchased. He contributed charm, physical presence, and an unwavering belief in his own exceptionalism that I mistook for something I wanted to support. Here's the thing about Ronan that I need you to understand. He wasn't attractive in the way he thought he was. He had a decent face and a gym body, but his personality was the real product. A personality I'd been inflating for 4 years with words of affirmation that I now realize were less about love and more about the sunk cost fallacy wearing a push-up bra. When he made his open relationship speech at that dinner, something shifted behind my eyes that I can only describe as a software update. The old operating system, the one that made excuses for him, that rationalized his financial dependence as temporary, that told myself his inability to hold a job was just because he hadn't found his passion yet, that system crashed completely, and what rebooted in its place was colder and clearer and had a very specific sense of humor. I looked across the table at Ronan, who was still talking about exploring connections and not being limited by societal constructs. And I said the words that would change everything. "You know what? You're absolutely right." His face lit up like a child who'd been told he could have dessert before dinner. He reached across and squeezed my hand, already scanning the restaurant like a man surveying a buffet. "This is going to be so good for us, babe. I knew you'd get it. Most women would freak out, but you're different. You're evolved." I smiled and sipped my wine and started doing math in my head. Not revenge math, recognition math. The kind where you calculate exactly what you've spent on a person and realize the number has more zeros than their contribution to your life has substance. Within a week, Ronan transformed into someone I barely recognized. Though looking back, maybe he was just finally showing me who he'd always been. He downloaded 3 dating apps and would sit next to me on the couch, swiping through profiles with the enthusiasm of a man Christmas shopping with someone else's money. Which, to be fair, was literally what he was doing since I paid for the phone and the data plan. He'd show me photos of women and say things like, "She's cute, right? I'm meeting her Thursday," as if we were browsing Netflix together. He started buying cologne in installments through Afterpay, which meant he was financing his ability to smell good for other women using a payment plan he could barely maintain. He posted photos with these dates on his Instagram story, not even trying to be discreet, almost as if he wanted me to see, wanted me to feel something, wanted to confirm that he had options, and I should be grateful he was coming home to me at all. His confidence was astronomical and completely unearned, built on a foundation of my compliments, my money, and my 4-year campaign to make him feel like the catch of the century, when he was, in objective reality, a 30-year-old man with $211 in his checking account and a closet full of clothes he didn't buy. The barbecue invitation came 3 weeks into the new arrangement. Ronan's mother, Vera, texted me directly, which she always did because she'd decided early on that I was the reliable one in the relationship, the one who actually confirmed plans and showed up on time and brought a side dish without being asked. "Summer cookout at the house this Saturday. Gavin's grilling. You'll come, won't you? We all miss you. Even Noel says so." Noel was Ronan's older brother. He was 33, worked as a project manager at a civil engineering firm, owned his own truck, paid his own bills, and had the kind of quiet, competent energy that made Ronan look like a rough draft by comparison. Noel had always been warm to me in that reserved, slightly formal way of someone who treats his brother's girlfriend like family, but maintains a respectful distance. He remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders. He asked about my career promotions and actually listened to the answers. At Christmas the previous year, he'd pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, very quietly, that if Ronan ever got his act together, he'd be the luckiest man alive. I thought it was a sweet, brotherly thing to say. Looking back, I think it was a confession disguised as a compliment, and I'd missed it completely. Saturday arrived, and I put on a sundress that I'd bought for myself with my own money, which felt like a small revolution given how much of my wardrobe budget had been redirected to Ronan's closet over the years. At the barbecue, the family dynamics were exactly as they always were. Vera running the show from the kitchen with the loving tyranny of a woman who'd raised 3 sons and a husband with an iron skillet and an endless supply of unsolicited advice. Gavin, the father, quiet and steady, flipping burgers with the focused concentration of a man who'd long ago decided that grilling was the only activity where no one asked him about his feelings. Ronan's younger brother Callum, 26, already on his second beer, telling stories about his plumbing apprenticeship that were funnier than they had any right to be. And Noel, standing at the grill next to his father, wearing a flannel shirt with rolled sleeves that he'd bought with his own credit card, smiling when he saw me walk through the gate in a way that made my stomach do something I hadn't felt in years. I walked over to him and he said, "Hey, I heard about the open relationship thing." His tone was careful, like someone stepping around broken glass. "You doing okay with all that?" I moved closer. "Actually," I said, "I'm doing great. Ronan wanted freedom. I'm just taking the same deal." Noel's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, a barely perceptible lean forward, a readjustment of his grip on the spatula that suggested his body was processing information his brain hadn't fully articulated yet. We talked for over an hour while Ronan socialized across the yard, telling cousins and family friends about his new, enlightened approach to love, as if he'd invented polyamory rather than simply deciding he wanted to cheat with permission. Noel asked me real questions about work, about my health, about the certification I'd been studying for. He remembered that I'd mentioned wanting to hike Mount Cataract 3 months ago and asked if I'd done it yet. At one point, our hands brushed when we both reached for the mustard, and the touch was so charged with something unspoken that I actually held my breath. Across the yard, Ronan was watching us. I could see him mid-sentence with his cousin, his eyes tracking the narrowing distance between me and his brother. Vera appeared beside me and pulled me into one of her signature hugs that smelled like garlic bread and Dove soap. She whispered in my ear with the casual devastation of a woman who had been paying attention for 4 years. "I always thought you were too good for him anyway." Then she handed me a plate of food and walked away. While I was recalibrating my entire emotional landscape over potato salad, Ronan's experiment in open dating was quietly imploding. His first date came home early, visibly deflated. Then the second, then the third. Every woman he met in person seemed to reach the same conclusion within 90 minutes. Ronan was a beautiful package with nothing inside. His stories about his fitness brand fell flat when women asked what his revenue was. His charm, which worked perfectly in controlled doses at parties and barbecues, curdled into desperation over a 2-hour dinner where the other person was actually evaluating him as a partner rather than a guest. He'd come home to our apartment and drop onto the couch like a man returning from a war that wasn't going well, and I'd watch from the kitchen and feel nothing, which was its own kind of freedom. By the end of the month, his confidence was visibly cracking. The cologne sat untouched on the bathroom shelf. The dating app stayed closed. He started cooking dinner again, something he hadn't done in months, as if proximity to a stove could substitute for the personality development he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. Then came the night he walked into our bedroom while I was getting ready to go out. "Where are you going?" His voice was different. The casual bravado was gone, replaced by something tight and uncertain that I recognized because I'd heard it in my own voice for years. I was putting on earrings in front of the mirror, the silver ones I'd bought myself for my last birthday because Ronan had forgotten. "I have a date," I said, watching his reflection. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Oh, anyone I know?" I turned around. "Yeah, Noel." The color left his face in stages, like watching a sunset in reverse. His lips parted, but no sound came out for several seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the first syllable. "Noel? My brother Noel?" I picked up my purse. "You said anyone. No restrictions, no rules, no jealousy. I'm just using the same terms you said." He stood up. "This is completely different. You can't date my brother. That's insane." I looked at him and felt, for the first time in 4 years, completely in control of a conversation with this man. "You said whoever I want. I want Noel. He's employed, he's interesting, and he remembers my birthday. Those are my criteria." His mouth opened and closed twice. He was trapped inside his own logic, a prisoner of the very freedom he'd demanded. I walked past him to the door and paused. "If this bothers you, maybe we should talk about closing the relationship." I said it knowing he'd never agree to terms that limited his own options. He couldn't close the door without admitting his entire philosophy was a costume he'd worn to justify doing whatever he wanted, while expecting me to wait faithfully at home. He stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Noel took me to a restaurant where they didn't know my credit card, which was refreshing. He opened the car door, which was novel. He ordered wine that he paid for with a card attached to an account containing more than 3 figures, which was practically exotic. We talked for 3 hours about things that mattered. Our families, our fears, his project at the firm where they were designing a stormwater management system for the county, my work implementing a new electronic health records system at the hospital network. He listened with his whole body, leaning forward, maintaining eye contact, asking follow-up questions that proved he was processing what I said rather than waiting for his turn to talk. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car and stood there looking at me with an expression that was so genuinely nervous it made my chest ache. "I've wanted to ask you out for 4 years," he said, "but you were with my brother, and I'd never do that." I reached out and touched his hand. He opened the door, Noel. He literally asked me to walk through it. That night, I posted a photo of us at the restaurant. Ronan viewed it from all 3 of his Instagram accounts within 11 minutes. The text started at midnight. First, the guilt trip. "We need to talk. You're doing this to hurt me." Then the accusation. "You planned this. You've been going after Noel behind my back." Then the ultimatum. "I'm closing the relationship. We're going back to normal. Just us." I didn't respond to any of them because I was at my friend Mei Ling's apartment, drinking tea and laughing harder than I had in months. Mei Ling had been telling me to leave Ronan since year 1, and she was handling my newfound clarity with the restrained joy of a woman who'd been waiting years to say, "I told you so," and was choosing instead to say it with shortbread cookies and chamomile. The next morning, I started the practical work of disentangling my life from Ronan's financial tentacles. I went back to our apartment while he was at the gym and pulled every receipt, every bank statement, every credit card record that documented what I'd spent on him over 4 years. The watch, the clothes, the rent payments, the grocery bills, the car insurance I'd been paying because his lapsed and he needed to drive to auditions that never materialized. I spread everything across Mei Ling's dining table and added it up with the grim precision of an accountant conducting a post-mortem audit. The total was $38,600. I took photos of every receipt and uploaded them to a cloud folder that Mei Ling helped me organize with the systematic intensity of a woman who'd done project management before switching to veterinary medicine. 3 weeks later, at the next family dinner, Noel and I walked in holding hands. Vera nearly sprinted across the living room to hug us both, her face radiating the specific joy of a mother who had watched her son pine quietly for years and was now witnessing the resolution she'd been praying for. "Jack has been talking about you for years," she said, then corrected herself. Sorry, I'm so excited I can't think straight. "He's been talking about you since the first Christmas you came to our house." Callum raised his beer in our direction and grinned. Gavin gave a single, satisfied nod, which from him was equivalent to a standing ovation. Ronan sat through the entire dinner without speaking, pushing food around his plate while the family orbited around Noel and me, like we were a new planet they'd been waiting to discover. His aunt kept making comparisons that weren't subtle. Finally, someone with ambition, and Noel always took care of the people he loved. Each observation delivered with a pointed glance at Ronan that he absorbed like blows. After dessert, Ronan followed me into the kitchen. He was standing between me and the doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't swallow. "Can we talk? Please." His voice was small in a way I'd never heard from him, stripped of performance, almost childlike. "I'm kind of busy," I said, rinsing a plate. "Please," he repeated, and his eyes were wet. "I made a mistake. The open relationship was stupid. I want to close it. I want us to go back to how we were." I turned off the faucet and looked at him. "That's not an ask, Ronan. That's a demand." He blinked. "No, I'm asking. I'm asking you to come back to me." The words hung in the air between us, and for a fraction of a second I felt the old machinery trying to engage, the part of me that had spent 4 years managing his emotions and preempting his disappointments and translating his selfishness into something I could live with. Then the new system kicked in and I saw him clearly. A man who wanted to close the door only because someone else had walked through it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Mine buzzed in mine. Mei Ling checking in because I'd been in the kitchen too long. I texted Mei Ling that I was fine and pocketed my phone. Ronan shifted his weight in the doorway, not quite blocking it, not quite not blocking it, occupying that ambiguous space between request and intimidation that some men inhabit without realizing it's a threat. I told him I needed to leave to handle something, and he said, "What's more important than this?" I looked at him and said, "Literally anything." I pushed past him, hugged Vera goodbye, squeezed Noel's hand, and walked to my car. The drive to Mei Ling's took 20 minutes, and she was already at the door with wine and a legal pad. She'd been a pre-law minor before veterinary school and had the instincts of someone who understood documentation. We spent the night organizing screenshots of every text conversation from the past month, including Ronan's messages about wanting the open relationship, his boasts about his dates, and his increasingly aggressive demands that I stop seeing Noel. Mei Ling arranged them chronologically and backed everything up to the cloud. "If this gets uglier," she said, sliding the legal pad across the table. You'll want a timeline that tells the whole story. Things got uglier faster than either of us anticipated. 3 days later, Ronan showed up at Mei Ling's apartment building at 11 p.m. He'd gotten her address from my work directory, which he'd accessed through my laptop that was still at our apartment, because I'd been too busy extracting myself from his financial ecosystem to retrieve my personal electronics. He pressed every buzzer in the building until someone let him in, then pounded on Mei Ling's door hard enough to rattle the frame. I know you're in there, he shouted, his voice bouncing off the hallway walls. You're ruining everything. You turned my own family against me. My own brother. I started recording on my phone while Mei Ling called building security. The recording captured 6 minutes of escalating volume, Ronan cycling through every emotional register from pleading to threatening to self-pitying, a greatest hits album of a man who'd never learned to process rejection because he'd spent his entire adult life being cushioned from consequences by women who loved him more than he deserved. Security arrived and escorted him out while he yelled about betrayal and fairness, and how none of this would have happened if I'd just appreciated what we had, apparently meaning his freedom to do whatever he wanted while I funded the operation and waited by the door. The next morning, I filed a formal incident report with Mei Ling's building management and received copies of the security documentation. I also called a legal aid clinic that Mei Ling's colleague had recommended and spoke with a paralegal named Deshawn Okafor, who had been assisting with domestic disputes for 7 years, and told me to keep documenting everything and start thinking about a formal separation agreement for the apartment. I drove to our apartment the next morning while Ronan was at his part-time gig and collected every receipt for items I'd purchased, including the Omega watch receipt from my jewelry box and the Nordstrom & Sachs email confirmations. I retrieved my laptop, my backup drive, and the box of financial records I kept in the hall closet. The apartment looked different without me in it. Messier, emptier, like a stage set after the crew has started packing up. On the kitchen counter was a stack of Afterpay notices and a past-due phone bill for the line I'd been paying. I took photos of everything, locked the door, and didn't look back. The separation agreement was drafted with help from Renata Pascal, a family law advisor at the legal aid clinic who had 12 years of experience, and a no-nonsense approach that I found deeply calming. She reviewed my financial documentation and calculated that Ronan owed me approximately $22,000 in loans disguised as gifts, specifically the rent differentials, utilities, and direct financial support that could be documented through bank transfers and Venmo records. She drafted an agreement giving him 60 days to vacate the apartment, which was in my name, and 10 months to repay the $5,000 she recommended as a realistic settlement figure. You could push for more, she said, adjusting her glasses. But the goal is to get out clean, not to litigate for years. I sent the agreement to Ronan's email on a Friday afternoon with red receipts enabled. He opened it in 4 minutes. His response came 6 hours later, not by email, but by showing up at my workplace the following Monday, where the building's head of security, a former military police officer named Terrence Adeyemi, removed him from the lobby after he began raising his voice in front of the reception desk. Terrence filed a formal no-contact order for the building and distributed Ronan's photo to all security stations. My supervisor, Priya, pulled me aside afterward and asked if I needed workplace safety accommodations. I told her what was happening, and she adjusted my schedule to include more remote days, saying simply, "Your safety comes first. The spreadsheets will still be here tomorrow." The family fallout was swift and revealing. Ronan called his mother crying about how I'd manipulated his entire family and stolen his brother, a narrative that required him to be the protagonist of a story in which he was clearly the author of his own destruction. Vera called me that evening, her voice thoughtful and measured, and said she'd been talking to the family about everything. She told me what I'd already suspected, that everyone had seen Ronan's patterns for years, but kept hoping he'd grow out of them. She said Gavin had been privately furious about Ronan's inability to hold a job since he was 22. She said Callum had lent Ronan $3,000 for business expenses 2 years ago and never been repaid. She said Noel had almost said something to me at Thanksgiving the previous year when he overheard Ronan asking me to cover the family gifts and then taking credit for them in front of everyone. I should have said something sooner, Vera said, and I could hear her crying. I kept thinking if I just loved him enough, he'd become the person I raised him to be. But you can't love someone into accountability. 2 weeks later, Ronan's public unraveling accelerated when women from his dating app adventures started finding me online. A woman named Phoebe Ingram messaged me on Instagram with screenshots of her texts with Ronan, in which he'd told her he was single and described me as his crazy ex who couldn't let go. She said their date had been a disaster because he couldn't perform and then blamed it on stress from our breakup for 20 minutes while she politely finished her drink and called a rideshare. Another woman named Kezia Thorpe sent me screenshots of Ronan asking to borrow money after their second date, claiming his wallet had been stolen. A third woman, whose name I won't share because she asked for privacy, sent me a voice memo of Ronan on a date complaining about me for 15 straight minutes while she recorded it because she couldn't believe anyone was actually like this in person. I saved everything. Not for revenge. For the record. because the record was all I needed. My counselor, Dr. Amara Obi, who I'd started seeing after the apartment incident, helped me understand why I'd stayed so long with someone who contributed nothing and expected everything. We unpacked my childhood patterns of caretaking, my tendency to equate being needed with being loved, my habit of inflating other people's potential because acknowledging their limitations felt like admitting I'd made a bad investment. She told me something during our third session that I've carried with me since. You didn't love Ronan. You loved the project of Ronan. And when the project was clearly failing, you kept investing because walking away meant admitting the loss was real. She was right, and hearing it hurt in the productive way that truth always does when it arrives after you've spent years avoiding it. We talked about boundaries and self-worth and the difference between generosity and self-erasure. And I left each session feeling like someone was slowly turning up the lights in a room I'd been sitting in for too long. Ronan signed the separation agreement on a Wednesday after his mother called him and told him, in the direct manner of a woman who had run out of patience approximately 4 years too late, that if he didn't sign it, she would personally drive to the apartment, pack his things, and move them into her basement where he could live until he figured out how to be a functioning adult. He moved out within 30 days, leaving behind the afterpay notices, the past due phone bills, and a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that said I'd ruined his life and turned everyone against him. I read the first line and dropped it in the recycling bin. The locksmith arrived within the hour. That weekend, Mei Ling came over with paint swatches and Thai food, and we spent Saturday repainting the bedroom a soft gray that Ronan had always vetoed because he wanted something more masculine, as if wall color was a gendered concept. We reorganized every room, removing the evidence of his occupation like archaeologists carefully extracting artifacts from a site that had been contaminated. By Sunday evening, the apartment was unrecognizable, and by that I mean it finally looked like a place where a competent adult lived alone and on purpose. The payments from Ronan arrived on schedule for the first 3 months, $500 deposits that showed up in my account like small, reluctant apologies. The fourth payment came with a memo line that read, "Sorry for everything," which I screenshotted for Renata's file and did not respond to because his apology was worth exactly as much as his promises had been, which is to say, nothing without follow-through, and follow-through had never been Ronan's strength. By month 6, I'd stopped thinking about him entirely on most days, which felt like recovery. My apartment was mine. My savings account was growing for the first time in years. My credit score had climbed 40 points since I'd removed him from my financial universe. Dean from work mentioned a senior analyst position opening up, and I applied the same day, feeling something unfamiliar and electric that I eventually identified as ambition uncomplicated by someone else's dead weight. Noel and I had been taking things deliberately slow, building something careful and intentional in the space that Ronan's chaos had vacated. We didn't post about each other online. We didn't make declarations at family dinners. We just showed up for each other consistently, which turned out to be the most romantic thing either of us had ever experienced, because consistency, when you've been starved of it, feels like luxury. He'd bring coffee to my office on his way to the engineering firm and leave it with reception without expecting me to drop everything and come downstairs. I'd cook dinner at his place on Fridays, and we'd watch documentaries about infrastructure projects that he found genuinely fascinating. And I found genuinely fascinating because watching someone care about something real was the most attractive quality I'd ever encountered. One night, 6 months after the barbecue, he got quiet over pasta and said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach clenched because quiet declarations over dinner had historically preceded catastrophe. He looked at me and said, "I watched him take you for granted for 4 years, and it was the hardest thing I've ever sat through. Not because I wanted you for myself, but because you deserved better, and I couldn't say it without making everything worse." His eyes were clear and steady, and he wasn't asking for anything. He was just telling the truth, which was so different from anything Ronan had ever done that I had to recalibrate my entire understanding of what honesty sounded like, coming from a man who actually practiced it. But 8 months after the split, I ran into Ronan at a grocery store. He was in the cereal aisle comparing generic brands, wearing faded jeans and a plain t-shirt that he'd clearly bought himself, which meant it was 2 sizes too large and the wrong shade of green for his complexion. The designer wardrobe was gone. The Omega watch was gone, probably sold on eBay alongside the Gucci belt and whatever else he could liquidate from the life I'd costumed him in. He saw me and his face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of emotions that settled on something almost like recognition, like he was seeing me for the first time as a person, rather than a supporting character in his story. He started to speak and I said, "I hope you're doing well," and meant it in the distant, genuine way you mean it about someone you used to know. Then I walked to the next aisle where Noel was examining olive oil labels with the focused intensity of a man who took grocery shopping seriously, and he smiled when he saw me and put his arm around my shoulders and we finished shopping together, like two people who'd earned every ordinary moment of their ordinary life. The proposal came a year to the day after that anniversary dinner, where Ronan had tossed a velvet box across the table and asked for permission to be unfaithful. Noel chose a hiking trail instead of a restaurant, a waterfall overlook we'd discovered together on a weekend trip that didn't require afterpay financing. He got down on one knee on a rock ledge with wildflowers behind him and pulled out a ring he'd saved for over 6 months without putting it on credit or asking anyone for help. It was simple and exactly right, and he'd chosen it because he'd noticed, months ago, that I twisted a small silver band on my right hand when I was thinking, and he'd asked my friend Mei Ling what my ring preferences were without making it weird. His hands were shaking when he slid it on my finger, and his voice cracked when he talked about building something real, something equal, something where both people showed up and both people paid for dinner and both people remembered birthdays without being reminded. I said yes, and then said it again, and then a third time, because once didn't feel like enough for a man who'd waited 4 years in respectful silence while his brother wasted every opportunity I'd given him. We called Vera from the car, and she cried so hard Gavin had to take the phone, and even Gavin's voice sounded thick when he said, "About damn time." Callum texted a string of celebration emojis followed by, "Does this mean I get to be best man? Because I already bought a suit." We drove home with the windows down and the ring catching light on my hand, and I thought about how Ronan had wanted an open relationship because he thought freedom meant having more options. He was wrong. Freedom was realizing you only needed one option, the right one, the one who showed up every single day without being asked, because showing up was never a burden when you actually wanted to be there.